We all like labels, and politics is no exception. However, the problem is that the two big labels that we use in politics, that being left and right, tend not to mean much at all. These labels oversimplify the field of political science into something that a 5-year-old can easily understand. Or rather, something simple enough so the politically uninterested normie can understand where he is and which side he should vote for once the next elections roll around without having the trouble to think about it. But the fact remains that these two labels are the cornerstones of the way that we understand politics, since we need a way to relate different ideologies to each other. In this essay, I will propose a system to graph ideologies and to relate them to each other with better labels that might actually mean something. The problem with left and right is that they are not grounded in anything. Even the names literally come from something as superficial as sitting to the left or to the right of the president in the Constituent Assembly of the French Revolution. Since the left-right system is very vague, there are nations that simply defy all categorization. For example, what is China? They proclaim to follow socialism with Chinese characteristics, but are also one of the most ruthlessly capitalistic countries in the world. However, at the same time, the CCP indirectly, and sometimes directly, manages all large corporations in the country and uses them to bring wealth and relative prosperity to the people. Concepts like horseshoe theory exist to try to explain cases like this where the right-left system simply does not make sense. Furthermore, it is also very difficult to quantify. What is more left-wing, Stalinism or anarchism? What is more right-wing, libertarianism or fascism? It might as well be as useless as trying to measure all colors from a white to black spectrum. There are three driving forces in politics. First is revolution, second is reaction, and the third one is inertia. All political movements are based on one of these three. The left is revolutionary, the right is reactionary, and the center is moved by inertia and is not grounded in anything solid. What is reactionary? So let's attempt to ground that political spectrum with the help of a strange little phenomenon. That is, when we look at our past, we see that it was overwhelmingly what we would call right-wing. We see that almost all civilizations were monarchies, religion was a central part of life, gender roles were firmly established, ethnic nationalism was the rule, and war was the most important affair in any state, etc. We might ask ourselves, what is the reason that our past is so overwhelmingly right-wing? Let's start with militarism, and let's use the Romans to illustrate this. So why was Rome so militaristic? If you can imagine being a Roman consul, then you have a very difficult position indeed. There are many rival civilizations that want to conquer, enslave, and rape you. The Romans got a very good taste of this in the sack of Rome in 390 BC. Their city was plundered, and the only option they had was to pay the Gauls off. However, while weighing the gold for the Gaulish king, Brennus, he threw his sword into the scale so that the Romans also had to pay the weight of the sword in gold. Then he said his famous words, Vae Victis, or Vae Victis, depends how you pronounce the Latin. After the sack of Rome in 390 BC, the Romans went on to build the strongest army in the Mediterranean. Now it would be their turn to conquer, sack, and burn. Everybody else learned the hard way that if they were militarily weaker than their neighbors, there is nothing standing between them and foreign conquest. The Romans did not become the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean because they were the most enlightened. The history of Rome is the history of criminals getting away with it because they were the strongest. From the rape of the Sabine woman to their genocides in Gaul and Carthage. This is because might makes right. Maybe not morally right, But what does that help you when your city is getting put to the sword, when your children are being enslaved, and when your culture is being erased? The ancient cultures had to be militaristic, or else they would be conquered and their names would be lost. All of this might seem a little bit alien to us since we have lived in a relative peace since 1945, and we have forgotten this iron rule of history. But you know who also forgot, did something really stupid, and is now getting reminded? But that is something interesting. If pacifism is left wing and militarism is right wing, then Ukraine really did something remarkable. After declaring their independence, they became much more pacifistic and even gave up their nuclear weapons. However, when the tensions with Russia escalated in 2014, they became more militaristic, and right now they are in total war mode. So there is a trick with right-wing policies like militarism. If you put a society under pressure, they will become more right-wing in a matter of days. If you give them peace, they will relax and become more left-wing. Weird, right? Now, does this trick also work with other right-wing ideas? Let's take monarchism, defined as the centralized rule of one person. The thing with leadership is that all effective mechanisms have it. That could be a restaurant, a company, or a work group. When you need to get shit done, you need competent and centralized leadership. All leadership structures relax when there is no objective and materialize when a group finds itself under pressure. In the ancient world, where famine and war were just around the corner, it was only natural that people looked for a capable leader to save them. And indeed, most of the leaders of the ancient world were monarchs. One of the big reasons for the age of democracy in which we live is that compared to 500 years ago, our lives are much easier. For example, do you know how the harvest was this year? Probably not. But you bet your ass that 200 years ago, everybody knew how the harvest went because a bad harvest meant hunger for everyone. Gender roles follow the same pattern. Before the 20th century, about half of all children did not make it past childhood. This means that in order to remain with a stable population, the average woman had to have at least 4 children. The average in the US in the 1800s was about 7. But when, due to modern medicine, youth mortality is not 50%, but 0.3, then there is no need to have that many children. This makes it possible for women to have the time to both be a mother and pursue a career. And since back in the day there were no washing machines, no vacuum cleaners, and no kitchen appliances, housekeeping was a difficult and indispensable job. But with our modern appliances, housewives have loads of free time, which eventually leads them to the workforce. The most important factor for gender equality was the convenience of modern technology. If we look, for example, to a community that does not use technology and has to work harder, like the Amish, we see very fixed gender roles combined with a birth rate of 0.6 or with 6.0 kids per woman. This general framework works with other elements, other right-wing elements, like tribalism, religion, keeping tradition, respecting authority, work ethic, etc. I could go on. However, all of these right-wing elements are made for one thing and one thing only: to make civilization stronger and more stable. Since all pre-modern societies faced immense amounts of pressure from outside and from inside, these elements are present in all pre-modern civilizations. From the Inuits to the Bedouins, they are human constants. They are a part of our nature as much as family and language are. Essentially, the standard, the default setting on human civilizations is right-wing. This gives us something that we can compare all other ideas to. The characteristics that are present in all pre-modern societies are called reactionary, and the characteristics that diverge from this constant are called revolutionary. A completely reactionary society is a militarist, ethnocentric monarchy with fixed gender roles, fear of innovation, and a rigid social structure. The best example that comes to mind is the Mongol Empire. They had a very reactionary culture because they had to survive in the steppe, which was no easy task. In the end, their resilience allowed them to conquer most of Eurasia. However, there is no real difference between Genghis Khan, the Babylonians, and the Prussians. Their societies worked in very similar ways because all three had the same goal: to survive. All reactionary thought serves survival. This sort of society is what I'm going to call a reactionary zero. Zero in the Cartesian sense of 0, 0, as in the center of a Cartesian plane. At the point 0, 0, we have the completely reactionary society, where all cultures once came from. A society becomes revolutionary by moving away one or many aspects of its culture away from the reactionary zero. The Soviet Union, for example, was economically revolutionary. However, in its work ethic, it remained reactionary. Lenin stated that he who does not work, neither shall he eat. And in that sense, he stayed on the same page as feudalism. Instead, it is us, with our food stamps and unconditional welfare, that are, in that sense, revolutionary. What is revolutionary? As much as reactionary ideas might be useful, not many of us want to live in a society where everything has to be dedicated to survival. War, even though it is a fundamental part of our nature, is also a great tragedy. Although fixed gender roles are needed to have large families and keep society growing, these gender roles also constrain the individuals, and they are not desirable for personal growth. Revolution comes in two parts. The first is atrophy, and the second is utopianism. A habit is any repeating action that you get used to. However, whole cultures can also have habits. They can be reinforced when they receive more attention, or they can slowly vanish when they lose importance. Reactionary ideas develop in societies under pressure. However, what happens to a culture that has managed to overcome or escape these pressures? The habits that secured our survival start to atrophy because they are not necessary anymore. However, it is part of human nature to strive towards something. When a society reaches a certain level of prosperity, we do not need to strive to survive anymore. As a consequence, we will experience a crushing boredom and a sense of meaninglessness. Out of this meaninglessness, into which most of us are born in, we will strive towards utopia. That is the source of revolution. Revolution is inherently utopian, and there is a strong desire for utopia inside all of us. We can observe this desire in the fact that all mythologies, or at least all mythologies that I've read about, have a concept of paradise. We can assume that utopian ideas are a part of human nature as well. My theory is that the idea of paradise comes from one of the most dramatic changes that we all have experienced: the gradual end of our childhood. When we are born, we're both completely innocent and completely helpless. In this state, we are dependent on our parents for food, warmth, and comfort. And, at least in the ideal case, we enjoy unconditional love. The reason that we enjoy our early childhood to the fullest is the element of innocence. The innocence of how the world works, of time and of death. In this case, ignorance is bliss. Let's take the example of object permanence. A newborn cannot understand that objects exist even though she does not see them. So her world consists purely of what is there, of how she feels and what she senses. That way, a baby has the unique capability to live fully in the moment, without a sense of worry or anxiety. When she wakes up in the night and misses her parents, she feels sad and cries. When her parents come to comfort her at 2 a.m., she relaxes and goes back to sleep without a care in the world. This innocence is complete when we are babies. With time, we learn to speak, and about object permanence, we enter middle childhood, where we learn about the world and get our first responsibilities. Little by little, we lose our innocence about the world. We had to go to school and do homework. Gone were the times where we could play all day. But also in school, you also experience cruelty for the first time. All of us were bullied and did in turn bully others. On the day when we realized that our grandpa is gone and he is not coming back, we understood death. Finally, we realized that love in the adult world is very much conditional. That people love you for who you are and what you do, not just for existing. In time, we were no longer innocent. We became teenagers and adults in a life full of work, worry, and eventually death. Why then is it surprising to see that we are all nostalgic for childhood? When we compare this to the story of the Garden of Eden, we see great similarities. We are in a place of wonder, where there is plenty of food and we are happy. However, we eat the apple of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and open our eyes to the world as it is. After that, we have to work to survive, and then we will ultimately die. The loss of both paradises, both Eden and childhood, come through knowledge of the world. However, in most mythologies, there is not one paradise, but two. One that we lost, and one that will one day come. When we are talking about mythology or theology, this next paradise is something that usually comes in the afterlife. However, this desire to regain paradise is constant. With the decline of religion in the last 3 centuries, all of these myths of paradise and the afterlife have been losing credibility. But our instinctive desire to return to paradise is still there. This utopian urge has instead been unleashed in this world and not in the next one. This urge to shape our world into a paradise is the source of the tremendous amount of political energy that were behind movements such as communism and liberalism. If we observe the way that communists talk about the classless society that will come after the revolution, we see the same themes of both early childhood and the Garden of Eden. Abundance for all and no material scarcity, no cruelty or exploitation, being cared for unconditionally and without cost, the capacity to engage in your own pursuits without obligations, and perpetual peace with no conflict? It sounds like it. Am I saying that all utopian, aka leftist, movements are just expressions of childhood nostalgia? Yeah, I am, pretty much. But it is not something to be belittled. This is a deep-rooted desire that we all have. So how does revolution actually work? The first prerequisite is a society that has enough prosperity, enough security, to not have to worry about survival. This puts the reactionary elements that were developed for survival and puts them in a state where they are no longer needed. When a reactionary institution, a political system, family structure, economic system, etc., is in the middle of atrophy, it becomes weak and can no longer justify its own existence. Only then is it ready for revolution. We never see revolutionary sentiments when a culture is under threat and needs its reactionary institutions. One of my favorite games to play when I'm arguing about the Vietnam War is imagine if it was World War II. In World War II, the US was actually under threat, so marching out with flowers in your hair and burning your draft card was not okay. It was what traitors and cowards did. However, in the Vietnam War, nobody was afraid of North Vietnam, so the army was not seen as an essential institution. Therefore, it became weak, and dodging the draft was suddenly cool. The second prerequisite is to have an ambitious middle class that can embrace revolutionary causes in order to gain power and influence that they do not have in the current system. In the French Revolution, we see that the old aristocracy and king were being deposed by a newly rising bourgeoisie that wanted the power that the aristocrats had. The revolution was not orchestrated by the sans-culottes, but by the Third Estate. In the Russian Revolution, almost all of the leading Bolsheviks, with the exception of Stalin, who was seen as a thug, were in fact middle-class intellectuals of the intelligentsia. Once you have these two prerequisites, it's showtime, and your revolution can begin. The violent revolution is quick and effective. We have seen it perform sloppily in the French Revolution and effectively in the Russian Revolution. When the government proves itself weak and there is blood in the water, like with a weak sovereign like Nicholas II or Louis XVI, the middle class revolutionaries seize the initiative and with the help of the working class, they take over the reins of power. This form of revolution is capable of making large changes in society in a short amount of time that would otherwise be impossible to make. However, such a revolution often leads to civil war, and it brings with it a revolutionary fervor that tends to be very bloody. After victory, the new ruling class establishes itself as a dictatorship and it becomes entrenched and self-interested. The gradual revolution is a more refined process, and one that is far more familiar in our side of the world. It is a gradual process where the status quo is slowly moved towards revolution through institutional power. The ambitious intelligentsia finds itself in the process of securing power. There is no power to be derived by supporting atrophied reactionary institutions, but there is definitely quite a lot of power to be derived from tearing them down and deconstructing them. This means that they are taken apart, dissected, if you will, and revealed as what they truly are: evil institutions used to oppress and exploit. At least in that sense, the lefties are right. In order to survive as a civilization in the pre-modern world, you had to keep everything and everyone in line. Once that they are no longer needed, these institutions are just ugly to look at. So they are denounced and overrun, and the remains are left out to rot in the outer fringes of society, with the peasants. This process happens primarily within the universities, where the intelligentsia multiplies, and nowadays the place that you have to go to if you want to have a successful life. The people who run the whole show nowadays always go to university, especially the people that become journalists and take the reins of public opinion, but also it applies to HR departments, to the entertainment industry, and to future politicians. Once the successful and educated people of a society embrace a certain political idea, it is just a matter of time before it becomes the cool thing to believe and the rest of society follows. Let's take an example that my teenage self was guilty of: atheism. When I was 14 and started getting into politics, I became involved in the creationist bashing bandwagon. Why? Because it made me feel smart and all the cool people were doing it, like Christopher Hitchens. Indeed, if you look at the most educated section of society, you see that religion is the least prevalent. In my time in the student dorms, I found that maybe 20% truly believed in God. On the other hand, I saw that most uneducated people believed. And I decided to go against that. Of course, looking back, I did it because I enjoyed the attention and because I liked feeling superior to the stupids. However, the pattern remains. Tearing down old institutions is fun and exciting. It could be the patriarchy, it could be racism, it could be capitalism, but the concept stays the same. The three main motivators of revolution are: first, the wish for utopia; second, the satisfaction of feeling righteous; and the third is the possibility of gaining power in a new society. How can reaction ever hope to compete with revolution? What is inertia? The last and most insignificant of all political forces is inertia. Inertia is not grounded in anything solid, like reaction, and does not move towards anything with its own power, like revolution. Instead, it hangs in between revolution and reaction and opposes the movement away from the present. It will denounce revolutionary movements as crazy and reactionary movements as regressive and dangerous. It favors things that stay the same as they are right now, or maybe at most as they were 10 years ago. This point of view is generally embraced by the average person. Of course, inertia is just another name for our friends, the conservatives. The thing with conservatives is that they are the eternal losers in politics. The simple reason for this is they have no stable base to ground their ideas on. So the only thing that they can appeal to is the opposite of their adversaries. But there tends to be no power nor clout in being a conservative, especially for the aspiring young members of the intelligentsia. Power, political power, comes from change. And if you want to climb to the top, you need to ride the waves of change. Conservatism opposes all of these changes, and because of that, it makes itself repugnant to our dear young intelligentsia. Conservatism is to them what being a hippie is to an aspiring sergeant. It is biting the hand that feeds you. There is only one exception to this: the tribune. In the Roman Republic, there were two classes of citizens: the patricians and the plebeians. Virtually all of the government offices were held by the patricians and patrician wannabes. But in the late Republic, we see some patricians start to acquire power through populism. They essentially betrayed their class in order to pander to the plebs so they can gain more power. The Gracchi brothers, Marius, and finally Kaiser, all of them were essentially class traitors, and we can see the same thing with leading conservative politicians. People like Trump were lifelong aristocrats that studied in prestigious universities and lived in their New York apartments, and suddenly they saw an opportunity to gain power by pandering to the proles with populist rhetoric. However, throughout history, conservatives always have ended up getting the short side of the stick when they are fighting against revolution and when they are fighting against reaction. Now, some of you may protest and say, actually, conservatism is reactionary, it is right wing. And to that, I would disagree with you, because it is not that conservatism is reactionary. It does not want a reactionary society. It does not want to get close to the reactionary zero. It just wants things to stay as they are. So it's not that conservatism is reactionary. Instead, it's that the culture is moving towards the revolutionary, towards the left. So conservatives look reactionary from that standpoint. To a liberal, a conservative would look reactionary because he's to the right of the liberal. However, the liberal would look conservative or reactionary to a leftist that is even more revolutionary than the liberal. So it's just all a matter of perspective. Another factor is that we see that conservatives nowadays are way less reactionary than conservatives 10 years ago, or God forbid, 100 years ago. Just because conservatism is to the right of the culture, it does not mean it is also not moving leftwards and it becoming more and more revolutionary. Since the culture shifts to be more revolutionary, the conservative wants the culture to stay as it is. And this stasis point, the status quo that the conservative wants to defend, is more and more to the left. A good example is that conservatives nowadays embrace LGBT affairs and even have their own LGBT chapters, while 20 years ago they were completely opposed to gay marriage. And let's not even mention that 60 years ago, the conservative position was to be against the Civil Rights Act. And if you go even further back than that, then conservatives were against women voting. So when we see modern conservatism and compare it to the revolutionary zero, it is so far removed that it is, to be honest, a wonder that they are still considered to be right wing. From a revolutionary standpoint, from a leftist standpoint, of course the conservatives look like reactionaries. However, when compared to actual reactionaries like Joseph de Maistre, like Otto von Bismarck, like Genghis Khan, the conservatives are so far removed from those people and those ways of thinking that to any other age in history, they would be liberals. How do we graph this? My idea how we can make this into a graph is simple. We have the reactionary zero in the center, symbolized by a circle, then some 10 to 20 arrows, depending how many factors we want to graph, that are pointing away from the circle, looking similar to a chaos symbol. To use the prior example of the USSR, we can put the work ethic of the USSR close to the reactionary zero, its economic policy as completely revolutionary, its military policy as reactionary, its religious policy again as revolutionary, and its gender equality somewhere in the middle. I hope that this was interesting and that it might help with having an overall better understanding of how political forces move and provide a somewhat solid basis for basing our conceptions of what left and right are. Thank you for your time and thank you for listening.